All right, let's get started. So please, if you can hear me, just tell me that the sound is okay. Okay, cool. So let's get started. So I'm going to go through some of the questions that I received from you guys, and then following that, I'll open it up to more questions from chat. So let's do this. So first of all, I was asked about the revolutions of 1848 by a couple of people. So let's go through this. Now, in 1848, once again, this is one of the super turning points, but it's been referred to as the turning point at which history failed to turn. And, in Metternich, the arch conservative leader from Austria, he said since the end of the French Revolution, liberal and radical revolutionary ideas that stemmed from the Enlightenment had spread all across Europe. Sometimes they were put there by Napoleon when he ruled over different parts of Europe, especially Germany, which had direct, impact and conquest by Napoleon. And these ideas just took deeper and deeper root, especially among younger generations in Europe. Now, during the 1820s and 30s, there had been some more uprisings. In France, a very conservative king had been overthrown by liberal forces. But basically, though, by 1848, you also have the rise of very intense nationalist tendencies, especially within the Austrian Empire, where you had all these different types of people, the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Ukrainians and so on, all who wanted to become independent or autonomous or whatever. So in 1848, then all of these forces come together, just tons of pent up, desire for rights and independence and freedom and equality, combined with this growing and intense sort of romantic nationalism. And then finally, in the years directly preceding 1848, there were slightly lower temperatures globally, which led to crop failures and increasing food prices. So all of this just came to a head in 1848. And also, you might remember in the 1840s, those crop failures included the potato famine in Ireland and other parts of Northern Europe. So that is also something that's going to contribute to these revolutions. Now, the locations, France is the first place where it happened in February 1848. But then from there, pretty much almost every other major country in Europe, except for Russia, Scandinavia, the Iberian Peninsula, and the United Kingdom, had some kind of uprising. Now, the thing is, there's a few sort of rules that are universal to how these things went down. Number one, revolutions it's easy to tear stuff down, but it's not that easy to build a new government and have a working, functioning society. And radicals, from all different classes, and socialists and nationalists from all different backgrounds. So, in Paris, this coalition rose up to overthrow the king, Louis Philippe, who was looked at as, kind of corrupt and he had sort of given up worrying about the welfare of the people, and he was a little bit older. So this coalition rises up, overthrows the guy, establishes a new republic, but because their goals and ideas politically and economically are so disparate, it's impossible for the coalition to stay together for very long. And the socialists, split from more liberal capitalists, and the anarchists are running around, doing whatever it is anarchists do. And by the end of 1848, you see big cracks show. And then the presidential election in late 1848 in France ultimately results in Napoleon III, or Louis Napoleon, being brought to power. And he very quickly sort of decides within a couple of years as president, this country is kind of getting torn apart again. I need to throw in my lot with the powerful, wealthy people of the country. to help me sort of stabilize the situation with the help of the army. So that's when you see a kind of turn back toward more conservative government and kind of authoritarian government under Napoleon III. Now in Germany, in the Austrian Empire, kind of the same thing. This brief kind of coming together of these very disparate political forces to rise up against their monarchs. So in the Austrian Empire, there's uprisings in Vienna, in Budapest, which is in Hungary, Prague, which is now part of the Czech Republic. And in all these different places, you have this coalition of liberals, radicals, socialists, and you also have this kind of X factor of nationalists, like especially in Hungary, who want independence, who want more autonomy. So the king of the Austrians at the time, like the Habsburg emperor at the time, he gets a little freaked out and, promises that Hungary can become more independent and he'll create a constitution and everyone will have rights. But then, the Czechs, they start asking for their own independence, their own constitution, and it becomes this mess that looks like it's going to kind of rip the empire apart. And at that moment, the Habsburg king creates an agreement with the Russian Tsar to send in a couple 100,000 troops, put this revolution down, and basically restore more authoritarian and sort of rock solid, Habsburg rule. So basically, then in the aftermath of this, once again, when the sort of like upper classes and middle classes start getting scared about how chaotic it's becoming, they're willing to support, once again, a kind of restoration of authoritarian monarchical rule. Same thing in Prussia and the German states. You have uprisings there, and it's tough for all the different forces to kind of stay together in the face of, just the difficulty of creating a working, functioning government system. And eventually you have liberals, middle class, upper classes turning away from like socialists and radicals and turning back toward authoritarian monarchy to just stabilize the countries again after like the sort of initial euphoria of the revolution has dissipated. So now in the aftermath then, by like 1850, the revolutions are basically done, but there's a few holdovers. France has become a republic. So they got rid of a constitutional monarchy. They became a republic, but they were under a very powerful president, Louis Napoleon, who eventually had himself declared emperor and became the next emperor of the French. In Germany, the German states and Prussia, basically, unification and constitutional government is kind of put on hold for a few more years. In the Austrian Empire, once again, the idea of constitutional government and independence for all the constituent nationalities of Austria are kind of put on the back burner just to like stabilize the country again. In Italy, though, briefly, the Pope had been forced by a revolution there to accept a constitution and become a constitutional monarch, but that once again got put on the back burner. And in northern Italy, Piedmont, Sardinia, a small kingdom there that eventually became the kingdom that ruled over all of Italy, that unified Italy, they actually maintained a constitutional system after this revolution. There, the revolution sort of led to a compromise outcome of a constitutional government under a relatively conservative monarchy, but a monarchy that was able to be sort of flexible. Middle class and liberal political groups, they sort of switch their allegiances back toward more conservative, monarchical and authoritarian types of governments, rather than this like brief flirtation with radicals and nationalists and socialists that had led to the revolutions in the first place. And then finally, this is kind of like the end of Romanticism, because Romantic nationalism and romantic like liberal and radical constitutional ideas had been sort of like swelling up and up and up and up and up, and then all of a sudden it's just like squished by these revolutions, and Romanticism is like dead. All of the air has blown out of those sails, And now another artistic movement begins soon after called realism, where the sort of focus isn't so much on like emotional, aggressive, enthusiastic politics, but more sort of like gritty, realistic, like, maybe we can't achieve everything we want kind of politics, and we should just kind of like deal with real practical reality. So Louis Napoleon, in 1851, he had a plebiscite, a referendum, just like the first Napoleon did, to have himself declared Emperor of the French. And then basically until 1871, he ruled France as an authoritarian dictator, but gradually became sort of more liberal over the course of his rule as he like consolidated his power, and as the French economy began to like grow again. He started to kind of loosen up a little bit and allow parliament and allow more freedom of the press and so on. So anyway, the outcomes, the revolutionaries didn't really get what they wanted, but it did lead to a sort of shift in political alliances, a restoration of more authoritarian governments, and nationalism. Conservative governments kind of see like the energy that nationalism had behind it and start to adopt it and kind of direct it toward their own ends, rather than allowing it to be kind of this like variable and this like wild horse that they have no control over. So that's when you have like conservative German leaders like Otto von Bismarck in Prussia and Napoleon III in France using nationalism and kind of trying to harness it for conservative goals and for their own political goals. So now, speaking of the unification of Germany, so I was asked about this. So once again, the unification of Germany shares a lot of similarities with the unification of Italy. You have a relatively conservative government, conservative monarchy, that expands through military force in order to basically absorb the rest of the territory that speaks their language. So it's not really like a bunch of different countries deciding on their own to really just like create something new. It's an existing political system that expands to absorb other countries. So in what eventually became Germany, though, the kingdom that engineered this process was Prussia, which had emerged as a power following the 30 Years' War. They were, the most militaristic state the most heavily militarized state in Europe, with like the largest army as a percentage of the population. And they were led in the late 1800s by a dynasty of monarchs called the Hohenzollerns. But when the process of unification was occurring, the king of the Hohenzollerns in Prussia was Wilhelm I. Now, his prime minister, though, his chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, an aristocrat from Prussia, he was the guy who really ran the government and really was the one who led this process. And he was conservative. Well, we did a DDQ about it. He was conservative in the sense that he wanted to make sure that the old institutions and the old elites of Prussia stayed in power even as things were changing in the country. So he was more interested in preserving stability and authority, even though he was flexible in some of the particular ideas and methods that he used to do it. And, in the late 1800s, he kind of embodied this idea of realistic politics, realpolitik, as it was called, where, whatever he needed to do using like secret negotiations and tactics to get what he wants. So before Bismarck, though, there had been some brief steps toward unification. So in 1834, Prussia led the creation of a free trade zone across northern and southern Germany called the Zollverein. And this allowed the easy flow of like iron and coal and resources and trade that made it possible for industrialization to begin happening all across Germany. So, and that was before these countries had really unified, but it was a free trade, customs union. Austria had been kept out of this. Austria had been cut out, and they sort of focused more on developing their empire separate from Germany. Now, 1848, very briefly, the King of Prussia had been offered a crown of a unified Germany, but because it had been offered by liberals and radicals who were involved with the revolution, he said no, and he basically said, like, if we're going to unify, it's going to be under Prussian steam, like Prussian power, rather than Prussia, agreeing to terms that someone else offers them. Now, by the 1860s, though, basically, like, it was clear that Germany had to unify, and conservative leaders, liberal leaders, by this point, Germans sort of understood, like, to become a power that can compete continuously with France or with England or Russia, these other great countries, we just have to unify. Like, there's no way that it's not going to happen. So, Bismarck then decided to engineer the process in the way that would benefit Prussia the most. So in 1866, he, we don't need to get into like the specifics here, but basically he kind of provoked Austria into attacking Prussia, knowing that, Prussia would just demolish them. And this war was also called the 7 Weeks War, because that's how long it took. By this point, Prussia had, a developed railroad network, and it made it easy for them to like move troops around and just kind of steamroll the Austrians very quickly. Now, after the end of the Austro-Prussian War, Prussia basically used their position of power to demand terms from Austria. They basically just told Austria, listen, we don't want reparations from you. We don't want any territory from you. All we want is for you to just stay out of German politics. We're going to unify. You're not going to be part of it. So, now, also by like defending Germany from Austrian aggression, Bismarck was able to convince and really, kind of tell elites in these other German states, listen, in order to maintain a mutual defense against aggression by other countries, you need to be under Prussian leadership. We need to create a unified system where we can have a sort of stronger national government and military and so on. So this leads to the beginning of the constitutional system that would become German. So the North German Confederation, where all of these North German countries unify under a constitutional system with a very strong constitutional monarchy under Wilhelm I and Bismarck, with a parliament, the Reichstag, where all of these states would be represented, but Prussia, because it was the biggest, was the most dominant state. So then, Bavaria, southern Germany here, this is a territory that was historically Catholic and culturally, somewhat different from northern Germany. So it was going to take a little more convincing to get Bavaria to, agree to join the German system. So in 1870, Bismarck, once again, kind of like tricked and provoked Napoleon III into attacking Germany. He knew that Napoleon was unbelievably just like prideful and, boastful and intensely nationalistic. So he kind of had, some of his ambassadors, like, he actually like falsified a letter that and made it seem more insulting than it had originally been intended to the French, in order to like provoke Napoleon into just reacting and snapping and attacking Germany, even though he really shouldn't have. So in 1870, then, the Franco-Prussian War, Prussia swoops in to rescue southern Germany from attack by the French. And now he can say, like, listen, I am defending all of Germany, even Bavaria. Like, the Prussians have come to your aid to keep the dastardly French from taking you over. So they like storm back into France. They occupy Paris in 1870 and take control of the city for several months and put down like another uprising there. And when they demolish the French army, now they can say, listen, we are clearly in charge of all of Germany. we need to unify once and for all and just Caesar, or the Caesar of the German Empire, the German Reich. Now, as part of the defeat of France, Prussia takes two provinces from the frontier away from the French, Lorraine and Alsace, and there's a bunch of like coal and whatnot in there. So these are like kind of useful provinces to have, but this is like a slap in the face, a dishonor that the French will never forget. They also forced the French to pay huge reparations to Prussia. So later on, when World War I happens and the Treaty of Versailles is being written, the French they're not forgetting about this. This is squarely in mind when they are so punitive toward Germany later on. So, also, Alsace is where Alfred Dreyfus was from, and his family actually elected to go to France after this war because they loved France more than they loved Germany. And yet, Alfred Dreyfus later on was going to be accused of being a traitor and railroad and so on, and like that, terrible anti-Semitic incident. So, now, next thing, we are going to talk about Spain and Portugal. Nick, Raymac, here you go. So, Spain and Portugal, we're going to go through some of the big stuff here. First of all, up to the 1400s, parts of Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, were ruled by Muslim forces and had been for hundreds of years. And this was a very sort of like diverse society with Jews, Christians, Muslims, all living in this one area. But during the 13 and 1400s, though, monarchies from the northern part of the peninsula began reconquering the rest. And this moment is known as the Reconquista. And this was kind of like a crusade. They had the blessing of the Pope to go and just like take over all of Spain and Portugal, drive out the Muslims, drive out the Jews, and make this a Catholic territory again. So this kind of crusading zeal became, kind of like a core of Spanish and Portuguese national identity later on. Now, the monarchies that took control over Spain and Portugal, though, they were ultra-Catholic. They were actually known as like the most Catholic monarchs. So they created inquisitions to root out any lingering Muslims or Jews or non-Catholics, to either forcibly convert them or drive them out of the country. So the Inquisition became this very sort of strong just tool of power that the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs used in the 1500s. So, now, of course, these are the two countries that begin the process of overseas exploration from Europe. The Portuguese are the first in the 1450s, actually earlier than that, under Henry the Navigator, a prince, not even the king, who organized a school at Lisbon, brought in sailors and navigators from all over Europe, especially Italy, to share knowledge and to go off a voyaging around Africa to finally try and get their way to Asia. So Henry the Navigator, he became kind of like this big national hero, someone who was looking to the future and trying to make Portugal a powerful, prosperous country. So now in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella were the king and queen of Spain, who got married in the 1490s and unified all of this country. They were the ones who sent out Columbus and began the process of Spanish exploration. So Columbus, 1492, got to America. Vasco da Gama was the first Portuguese sailor to get all the way around Africa and up into India. And then the Spanish sent out Magellan, the first sailor to get all the way around, one of his ships got around the world. He died in the Philippines during this voyage, and only one of the 5 ships that went out with him actually made it all the way back. But the Portuguese, though, they began setting up a trade empire as soon as they started going around Africa. And they started taking some port cities around Africa by force, and then up in Asia, and they set up a mercantile system where they would license merchants going in and out of the ports to make a little profit. They would require them to use Portuguese merchants as go-betweens. they would basically try to squeeze as much revenue as they could out of those ports. And the system was working pretty well. I mean, Portugal was a relatively small, resource-poor country, and they learned how to make money from it. Now, they also started setting up plantations for sugar right off the coast of Africa. So even before Columbus got to America, the Portuguese were already doing sugar plantations right off the coast of Africa using slave labor just brought right over from Africa. And, they sold goods to West African kings for gold, brought gold and silver back to Europe to spend there. So basically, they're starting to get money out of this. Now, of course, the Spanish, though, were the ones who took over, the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, started to literally, pull silver out of the ground there and use it to their benefit. Now, back in Spain, though, Spain became part of the Habsburg monarchy. And Charles V, he was the one who literally brought the Austrian Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Emperors, into conjunction with the Spanish Habsburgs. And during his lifetime, he ruled over basically half of Europe as well as most of the Americas as a monarch. But he eventually, realized that this was totally untenable. So even though he was building up the army and the navy under his leadership and building up the colonies in America under his leadership, it was just too much. So he split the monarchy in half. The Spanish Habsburgs became one branch of that monarchy. The Austrian Habsburgs became the other half. And eventually the Netherlands, that was going to become independent from the Spanish Habsburgs, who ruled over it at that point. So the Habsburgs, though, are going to traditionally be the ones considered the most Catholic monarchies, or the most Catholic monarch in Europe. And during the Reformation, they're going to be the ones who are really most aggressive at maintaining Catholic rule and Catholic unity across Europe. So they'll be the ones fighting against Protestants and fighting, funding the Catholic forces in the French Wars of Religion, and helping their cousins during the 30 Years' War and fighting against Elizabeth I when she supports Protestants on the continent. So they're going to always be sort of pushing for Catholicism. Now, Spain also becomes one of the great centers of the Renaissance, though. And in the royal court at Madrid, that's where you're going to see, a great number of painters during the late Renaissance, especially El Greco, a Mannerist painter, who will become famous in the 1500s there. Now, eventually, though, the Habsburgs, the last Habsburg king dies right around 1700, the last Spanish Habsburg king. He leaves his kingdom to Louis XIV's grandson. And Louis XIV had married a Habsburg Spanish princess, so that's why he has, son or a grandson who's in line for the throne there. That sets up the War of Spanish Succession because basically the rest of Europe is no, we can't have a puppet of Louis XIV running this other kingdom. So a coalition of other countries go to war against France and Spain to try and keep this from happening. Now, as a result of this war, this is the first major collapse of French royal finances. They're deeply, deeply in debt. And as a result of this war and the treaty that stemmed from it, they're not allowed to formally ally with Spain, but Louis's grandson is allowed to take the throne. But at the same time, this is when Britain takes over the Rock of Gibraltar. So the British are the ones who actually end up with control of the Strait of Gibraltar rather than the Spanish. And even to this day, the British still control that and use it as a naval base. Also then, the Spanish allow the British to be the main importers of slaves into Spanish colonies in America. So that becomes an incredibly lucrative deal for the British. So this kind of weakens Spain a little bit, even though it's kind of a compromise, so Louis sort of gets what he wants as well. Now, over the next 100 years, though, the Spanish economy was going to decline pretty steadily because they maintained a very strict mercantilist system where, there wasn't really that much private investment, and there wasn't really that much economic development in Spain itself as they were pulling silver out of the ground in the Americas. So by the time that rapid inflation had really started to take hold, by the time that other countries like the French and the British and the Dutch had started to become more capitalist, the Spanish had not really sort of kept up. And by the early 1800s, the Spanish colonies wanted to gain their independence. So Spain and Portugal, when they were conquered by Napoleon in the very early 1800s, basically all of Latin America saw their opportunity to gain their independence. So the Spanish colonies, like Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela, Creole elites there, so like white colonists there, lead an independence movement, guys like Simón Bolívar. And to some extent, they were interested in pursuing Enlightenment ideas. They wanted a constitutional government. They wanted legal equality and representative governments. And in the aftermath of those wars of independence, some Latin American countries achieved stability and success. Others didn't quite sort of live up to the goals of their original independence leaders. But in any case, they became independent. Slavery is abolished all across Spanish colonies. And Portugal the king of Portugal actually fled to go live in Brazil after Napoleon took over the peninsula. And after Portugal became independent again, after nationalist uprisings and insurgencies that drove Napoleon out, the king of Portugal went back, but he left his son to rule over Brazil, and eventually that sort of split off into its own separate independent country. Now, so the monarchy was restored in Spain though after Napoleon was defeated, and over the course of the 1800s, the monarchy there remained sort of stubborn about allowing a constitution or any kind of updates to their system that were taking place elsewhere in Europe. But Spain is continuously sort of losing power economically and politically. They lose more of their colonies overseas in the Spanish-American War. And then finally, in the 1920s and 30s, in the depths of the Great Depression, this is going to lead to enormous changes. So in Portugal and Spain, fascist governments take power in the early 30s. Basically, claiming to be sort of showing the same kind of promising the same things that Mussolini was promising in Italy and that Hitler was promising in Germany. They were going to use powerful authoritarian rule to create very powerful, prosperous, dynamic states. So from the 30s until the 70s, both Portugal and Spain are going to be ruled by authoritarian military dictatorships. And they never become as, they never have the same levels of racial violence that the Nazis do, but they maintain very sort of powerful dictatorial systems until the 70s. Now, and then from there, in the 70s, they start to transition back toward democratic systems. So now in Spain, though, basically the whole time all of this is going on, but especially in the last few decades, there are a couple of separatist movements that are worth taking note of. So in northern Spain, this region here that kind of straddles the border with France is called Basque country. And this is a group of people who have a totally unique language. Their language is not related to any other language in Europe. And they, understandably look at themselves as a totally sort of separate nation of people from the Spanish. So for decades, there's been a very intense Basque separatist movement that kind of, rears its head and becomes violent and then sort of quiets down a little bit again. But that's been going on. And in Catalonia, the sort of northeastern part of Spain, right around Barcelona, there's been an ongoing separatist movement there as well. And under the dictatorship, under Francisco Franco in the 1930s through the 70s, Barcelona was kind of the epicenter of this anti-fascist resistance, along with being a separatist area. And actually, Barcelona, the soccer team, became kind of like a rallying point for anti-fascists and for the separatist movement since then. So anyway, that's that. So guilds, what are they? So guilds kind of became a thing in the Middle Ages, in the towns and cities that were popping up, as the population grew, as Europe was starting to transition away from like a sort of feudal system. Guilds were kind of like labor associations, or kind of an early version of like a trade association. And guilds were generally made up of skilled laborers, people who did the same job. So in London, for example, you would have a guild of all of the bakers, a guild of all of the silk merchants, a guild of all of the coopers, the people who make barrels, a guild of all the stonemasons, or the carpenters, or the haberdashers, or whatever. And these guilds, they would have the right given to them by city governments to maintain control over their industry. So they would maintain licensing standards. So if you wanted to become like a master, carpenter, you had to pass through like a training system where you would start as an apprentice, then work your way up, until you became good enough that other carpenters would accept you as one of them, as someone who was able to uphold the standards of the industry. Now, this was a way of maintaining high skills and high standards for their business, but it was also a way to control prices in business practices, because basically like the people who were in the guild could lock out people who wanted to join. So guilds, though, also were kind of like a social network, and within guilds it was fairly common for families of guildsmen to like take care of each other. So they were sort of mutual aid societies. So if a member of the guild, if a master carpenter died or got sick or something, then the others would like pool some money together to give to the family to help support them. And it was actually pretty common. This was like one of the ways that women in late medieval Europe actually could acquire property, by being given, some financial assistance by other members of the guild that the woman's husband had been part of. And some guilds were open to women in the late Middle Ages. So, now, even though this was good for the people in the guilds to be part of the system, it was also something that was looked at by other members in society as sometimes a little restrictive and, potentially corrupt. So the guilds, though, they derived their power from city governments or local feudal lords who gave them the legal right and potentially the coercive force to actually maintain their stranglehold over industry. So there are going to be challenges to the system. So in some cases you have challenges by members of government itself. So in France, for example, Louis XIV's finance minister in the mid-1600s, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he thought that the guilds were holding France back, and that like the Dutch, who were capitalists, who were more sort of free market, were getting ahead of them. So he decided to like break the power of guilds in all the major cities of France and open up those industries to more people, which would lower prices and increase the availability of all sorts of goods and tools, and basically just kind of allow more rapid economic growth in France. So he tried to break the power of the guilds. In England and in the Netherlands, when you have more sort of laissez-faire ideas about capitalism and more sort of liberal ideas about trade and economics emerging, you start to see challenges to the guild system there, where economists start to argue, you know what, this is actually restrictive. This is keeping prices higher than they should be, and it's keeping our economies from becoming as innovative or dynamic as they should be. Because guilds quite often were kind of, in some cases, were willing to adopt new technologies within their particular industry. In some cases, though, they were resistant. They're like, no, we know that this type of machine is going to like put us out of business, so we're not going to do it. So more sort of liberal, laissez-faire, capitalist type people advocated getting rid of the guild system. So in England and the Netherlands and France, you also see the beginning of the putting out system, where capitalists and like wool merchants or something from the cities, to get around the guilds in the cities, will just go to villages out in the countryside where there are no guilds, and just pay peasants to do to do some of the labor in creating finished goods in order to get around the restricted guild system. So all across like northern France and southern England in the 1700s, you see this system developing where like smaller villages will become home to these cottage industries and start kind of replacing guild production in the cities. And then ultimately, of course, the steam engine, mechanization, the factory system of the Industrial Revolution just obliterates the guild system altogether. Because now anything that a master weaver can do can be done 1,000 times faster and cheaper by machines in a factory. So the factory system just destroys the guild system. And then ultimately the unskilled workers in factories will create this new kind of labor union system during the 1800s as labor unions become legalized across Europe. So, finally then. Meredith, give him the bit. Oh well. Gus is a little angry right now, so he's not going to say hello. Okay, so last topic that I was asked to pontificate about was the Enlightenment and the Romantic movement. Now, these movements, in many ways, they're sort of like polar opposites, but in some ways, they're very closely connected. So the Enlightenment, this is the intellectual movement that began right around 1700. I guess you could say it began with the Glorious Revolution in England, where you have Parliament, non-violently replacing an absolutist monarch with an enlightened constitutional monarch who gives people rights and freedom and blah, blah, blah. So the Enlightenment, though, it's really rooted in the scientific revolution. And the idea that through reason and rational thought, we can come up with ways to make progress, to improve the world, improve society, and make it work in a better way, a way that just makes sense. So the philosophes are the philosophers of the Enlightenment. John Locke, he was the one who defended the Glorious Revolution by saying that, it is the right of the people to replace a corrupt government with one that is willing to respect their rights if they feel like, the situation is totally untenable. He also was an advocate of religious toleration and constitutional government and the idea of natural rights and tabula rasa, that everyone is a blank slate who is not born with some like innate quality, that, if they're an aristocrat, fourth person, or whatever. The Baron de Montesquieu from France, he was an aristocrat who advocated constitutional government with a separation of powers and checks and balances. So, we know where that became influential. Voltaire was like the king of the philosophes. He was a playwright and just kind of like troublemaker who got kicked out of France a couple of times, kicked out of Prussia. He went to Russia for a little while. And he advocated religious toleration, especially. He advocated, freedom of speech and, the right of people to speak without a government censoring them. He also, though, defended absolute monarchy when it was enlightened, when it was used for sort of enlightened purposes. Now, Diderot, he was the compiler and editor of the Encyclopedia, which as a concept was very sort of Enlightenment, where you would collect all the things that people know, all of the useful information and knowledge about the world in one place, where it would then be available in print for everybody. So the idea that you could just have all of the knowledge there for anyone to read and learn was a very enlightened idea. Immanuel Kant is German, and he's kind of like Rousseau. They represent like the tail end of the Enlightenment of the late 1700s. Guys who started to become a little disillusioned because over the course of the 1700s, no matter how enlightened they wanted people to be, European countries were still fighting terrible wars against each other. Churches were still powerful. So Immanuel Kant was a German who basically decided that, you know what, enlightenment is not something that society can do. It's only an individual process. And individuals can become enlightened, and perhaps if enough do, then society would become enlightened. But it's basically like the job, the sort of mandate of humans to become enlightened individually. Now Rousseau, he was kind of like the last philosopher, and he was alive right before the French Revolution. He was the one who advocated direct democracy, the social contract, and the general will, that the only way for society to work was for everyone to be involved, and then for society as a whole to respect the general will, wherever that may lead. He also advocated education based on virtue and values rather than, like mechanical skills. So he basically was the one who advocated like letting kids be kids and then learn how to be useful, learn how to be good and virtuous and moral first. And then through there, society would become more enlightened and virtuous and moral. And Rousseau, he was actually a big influence on the Romantics, because he kind of denied the idea that you could just like think your way to a better world. He felt that there was more of like a feeling that you needed to have, and that through sort of moral connection and through a sort of like virtue and an understanding of your connection to others in society, that would make the world a better place. Then Adam Smith was an economic thinker, and he's associated with the idea of laissez-faire capitalism. Now, he gets misinterpreted a lot though, because later on, some people will say that Adam Smith advocated complete free market capitalism with zero government role in like anything. But in reality, he basically just felt that anything that sort of kept people from really being as productive as they could was bad and should be done away with. So he thought that guild restrictions were a thing of the past, mercantilism should be done away with, and he advocated the idea that people should be free to buy and sell what they want, to produce what they want, to get whatever job they want. But he did advocate governments, paying to build infrastructure, to facilitate trade and production, to basically like give people the tools and like the playing field to be productive. He advocated public education, basically having governments invest in their people to make them more skilled and productive. But, once people sort of had the skills, let them go and produce what they want and buy and sell what they want. And he also actually advocated, basically anti-monopoly practices by governments to make sure that single businesses wouldn't get so big and powerful that they would just crush competition and, exploit workers and consumers. So he was actually someone who advocated free markets as long as they didn't become oppressive or corrupt or exploitative. So, now, Romanticism, though. Oh, and the Enlightenment, obviously this would become very influential in the French Revolution, but other revolutions too later on. And just generally through the 1900s, Enlightenment ideas spread into European colonies, in like Africa and Asia, and nationalist leaders and independence leaders, guys like Gandhi, would argue along Enlightenment lines, like, hey, you promise equal rights and legal equality for your own people, why not for Indians too? So Romanticism then emerged in the French Revolution and then became super influential through the early 1800s. And a few big names here to be aware of: Lord Byron, William Blake, and then the Shelleys. So Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, these were all English romantics, and this was an artistic and literary movement. And basically the attitudes and ideas, it was kind of a reaction against the Enlightenment, and it was kind of based in Rousseau and the idea of virtue. But the attitudes here were that reason and rationalism is actually kind of dehumanizing and gets us away from what makes us humans. And the French Revolution, to a great extent, especially during the radical phase, was led by people who believed in just like action and enthusiasm and emotional intensity as like the basis for their decision making and their lives. And in addition to that, then romantics were very much anti-industrialist and more sort of focused on the idea that nature itself was powerful and that nature was beautiful, and that the way to live an authentic, good life was to sort of be in touch with nature and respect nature because we came from nature. And also, they sort of looked backward. They glorified the sort of aesthetics of the Middle Ages and like Gothic architecture and institutional churches and established churches. They advocated intense romantic nationalism. This idea that like being a nationalist, being German, being French, meant you kind of had this like feeling that you just were German or you just were French and you had French blood, pumping through your veins. So nationalism wasn't so much like a rational political attitude as it was just feeling, an emotion that you had. So in Germany, there were very famous romantic nationalists there, Fichte and Ernst Arndt. And in Italy, the two great romantic nationalists were Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi, who were these leaders of this intensely sort of emotional nationalistic movement. Like, they advocated this idea of just feeling Italian. And if you were Italian, you just kind of knew it deep down. And, Italian blood would, like, course through your veins and drive you to do great things. So, the Romantics, they were obsessed with, like, weird and exotic. And this was kind of a reflection of how deeply intertwined places like England and France had become with their colonies overseas and with exotic cultures in Asia and Africa, which influenced the Romantics. So the Romantics, they read the Arabian Nights, surrealist and sort of like, I guess you could say kind of like visions. So now, there's another question here from Rocio. The difference between the Glorious Revolution and the English Civil War. English Civil War, 1640s. Glorious Revolution, 1680s. English Civil War, extremely violent. Parliament, led by, Calvinist Puritans, Oliver Cromwell, cut the king's head off, Charles I. So extremely violent. And then for a few years, they ruled England as a republic. But then the monarchy was restored. The Stuart monarchy was restored with Charles II. And for a couple of decades, Parliament is kind of back in the driver's seat. But then the Glorious Revolution, James II was going to like openly reinstate Catholic rule over England. So Parliament once again drives him out. He flees the country, he goes to France. William and Mary are brought in from the Netherlands. They're Protestant, and they agree to rule as constitutional monarchs. They sign the Bill of Rights. It's basically nonviolent. So those are the big differences. English Civil War, very violent. Glorious Revolution, not so violent. English Civil War results in, eventually the restoration of the monarchy, glorious revolution, creation of a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary supremacy. Yeah. Any other questions? John, why are you watching an AP Euro stream? Getting ready for next year? All right, so if there's no more questions, I'm going to shut it down for the evening. So remember, a few more tips for the exam tomorrow. Number one, make sure you go through the multiple choice quickly. So don't get caught up on one particular question, eliminate answers, go with the answer that seemed right. And also, make sure you watch your time. So bring a watch if you need to, so you can have a good sense of exactly how long you have left. For the DBQs, use at least 6 of the documents. Use all 7 if you can. Explain the evidence in the documents. Don't quote. Explain. Don't quote. Now, for the SAQs, and really for everything, explain as much as you can. Explain as many different aspects or ideas as you can within your prompt. Because once again, like for the SAQs, it'll never be enough to just have like a one-word or one-phrase response, like, "Oh, the answer is communism." No, explain how that shows whatever the prompt was asking for. And for the LEQ, pull as many threads as you can. Explain how and why things are happening. Look at the prompt from as many different angles as you can. And, if it asks you for continuities, think about changes as well. Just think as broadly as you can about every possible way to address a question. And constantly explain how, why. For the DBQ, connect the documents to each other in as many ways as you can. Make as many arguments as you can based on what the documents have shown you about the prompt. So the more sophistication you can show, the better off you're going to be. And don't think about what you don't know or what you can't do. So if you don't think you're going to get a 7 out of 7 on your DBQ, don't lose your mind and freak out. The national average score on the DBQ was like a 2-point something last year. Get as many points as you can. Do the things you know you can do, even if it's not a perfect score, because nobody gets a perfect score, so don't even worry about it. On the LEQ, if you're having trouble, if you're blanking a little bit, write as much as you can about examples of evidence that fit the prompt, and attack it from as many angles as you can. Explain as much about how and why. Be specific when you can be specific. So if you see something like, if you're going to say something like America or European colonists set up cash crop plantations in the Americas and imported slaves from Africa, talk about what were the cash crops, where in Africa were these slaves imported from, which countries were transporting them. Be as specific as you possibly can. And for the DBQ, anytime that there is anything that's mentioned in the documents but isn't explained, so a word or a name or an event or some concept that's referred to, and you know what it is and can explain more, bring it in. Bring in outside knowledge that's not in the documents at absolutely every moment you possibly can. So for the prompts that say like evaluate the extent to which or evaluate whether or not, once again, look at what the evidence has shown you. Look for as many arguments as you can possibly make, because the way that these essays are set up, the people who are grading them and the people who create the essay prompts, they're giving you room to be sophisticated and nuanced. They don't really want to see just, yes or no, one side or the other. they want to see that you can kind of see different angles and different sides of an argument. So it's totally appropriate to kind of come down in the middle of an evaluate from. Well, he was sort of absolutist, but in these ways, but in these other ways, he wasn't. So be as sophisticated and kind of like multivariant as you possibly can. And in your thesis, let your thesis reflect that sophistication. So all of the arguments you're going to make, say those arguments specifically in your thesis statement right at the top. So if you're going to say that, yes, Louis XIV was an absolutist, be specific in the thesis about the ways in which he was absolutist. So be specific, be as thorough as you can, explain as much as you can, use all the documents. And once again, there is partial credit. So if a couple of documents give you trouble, use all the ones you can, and you can still get a point. And don't quote, explain. And use the document numbers and parentheses to make it clear to yourself and to the grader, which documents you're using. So, one more question here about religious toleration. So, the Edict of Nantes, 1598, Henri IV, the King of France, Henry IV, he had been Protestant, he became Catholic just to bury the hatchet with the Catholics in the religious wars of France. The Edict of Nantes was a very sort of it was a big compromise by both sides, because by that point, Catholics and Protestants, the Huguenots in France, had been fighting each other for 3 decades. Henry IV says, you know what, we're going to settle this. Both sides were tired of fighting. The Edict of Nantes said that Catholicism was the religion of the French monarchy, the established religion of France. But Protestants in France could have freedom of religion in their towns, and they could fortify their towns to defend against Catholic violence. So it was kind of unsatisfactory in multiple ways. Catholics didn't like it because they thought that, why are you letting Protestants arm themselves against us? Protestants were like, well, yes, we can have a religion, but we're not allowed to practice our religion outside of these towns and cities. So it remained somewhat divisive for the next few decades, and ultimately Louis XIV revoked it in the late 1600s, partly because he wanted to just, once again, consolidate his power, even though ultimately it was bad for France in the long run to drive Protestants out of the country. So in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, that was a compromise by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Catholic, with the Lutheran princes of the empire, allowing Lutheran princes to remain Lutheran, but in Catholic countries, though, within the empire, people were expected to remain Catholic. Basically, whatever the ruler or the prince wanted to do, that's what his people would do. 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, that gave private religious toleration to Calvinists and Lutherans in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, eventually then, in the 1700s, in England, basically all religions become tolerated. So Catholicism, Judaism become sort of okay in England. The French Revolution is actually the first moment when full religious toleration is given to all religions in a country. It's in law, in writing, that even Jews had full civil rights. Prussia had usually been pretty tolerant as well during the 1700s and 1800s, and they were doing so to kind of bring in refugees from France with their money and with their skills and know-how as well. The Netherlands was usually pretty tolerant for the same reason. They wanted, because it was kind of good for business as well as good for human rights. So, any other questions? Peyton, if you're going to cry, just make sure you don't do it during the exam, because then you might smudge your writing on your essays. Okay, So my better half is telling me to shut it down because it's dinner time. So have a great night. Don't stay up too late. I know the impulse will be there to study like all night long, but get a good night's sleep. Eat a good breakfast in the morning with protein and fat, not just like a croissant or something. Protein and fat that'll keep you full and come ready to party tomorrow. All right. And remember, we have second hour class right before the exam, so if you have any more questions, you'll be able to ask me more questions in class tomorrow. So have a good night. Bernstein out. Goodbye.